The cold March wind howled through the bare trees of Clayville, carrying with it a heaviness that settled over the county fairgrounds like a storm about to break. The horse auction was in full swing, boots caked in mud, rough hands gripping coffee cups and bidding cards, voices low and impatient. Then everything seemed to slow, just for a second, when Orville Dean stepped into the crowd. His sweater was worn, stained with dust and time. He clutched a battered felt hat to his chest, his shoulders hunched, like he was carrying a world no one else could see. And in that moment, every eye turned toward the stranger who didn't belong. Orville said nothing. His tired blue eyes scanned the pens until they landed on one horse, a powerful chestnut stallion with a white blaze down his face, just like the one in the photo. Muscular, alert, and calm under pressure, he stood apart from the others. But it wasn't just his beauty. There was something else. The way the animal stood, still, watching, waiting, like he too was searching for something. When the horse's eyes met Orville's, there was a flicker. Recognition? Memory. It was enough to stop Orville in his tracks. "That horse is mine," Orville murmured. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just said it, as if it were a fact older than the fences around them. Laughter erupted behind him. "That one?" "Sir, you couldn't afford the tail on that horse," said a man in a worn denim jacket, shaking his head. Another added, "Go on home, old-timer. You're embarrassing yourself." But Orville stayed still. The hat trembled in his hands. His breath grew heavier. His gaze never left the stallion. Deputy Frank Mallory, a local officer known for being tough but fair, stepped in. "Sir," he said gently, laying a hand on Orville's shoulder, "you can't be here. I'm gonna have to ask you to step away from the pen." Orville barely moved. His face was pale, his lips parted like he was about to speak, but nothing came out, just a quiet ache held inside for too many years. As he took one reluctant step backward, the impossible happened. The chestnut horse reared up violently, slamming his hooves against the metal rails with a thunderous crash. The crowd jolted back in alarm. The stallion's eyes were locked on Orville's, ears pinned, muscles tense. It wasn't panic. It wasn't rage. It was something else. Something deeper. The horse cried out again, a long, piercing whinny that echoed through the lot like it came from another life. The laughter stopped. No one was joking now. Orville dropped to his knees in the mud. He clutched his hat tightly against his chest, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" he whispered, voice breaking. And the stallion, wild, unclaimed, priceless, lowered his head just slightly, letting out a soft, almost mournful breath. For a moment, time froze. No one could explain what they had just witnessed. But deep down, they all felt it. This wasn't just a man and a horse. This was a story buried long ago, and it had just begun to surface. The crowd didn't know what to say. The silence that followed the stallion's outburst was heavier than any words. Deputy Frank Mallory kept a firm hand on Orville's arm, but something in the deputy's eyes had shifted. He wasn't looking at a trespasser anymore. He was looking at a man broken open by something real, a truth too raw to mock. Around them, people muttered nervously, stealing glances at one another, pretending not to feel what they felt. The kind of moment that sticks to your bones and doesn't let go. That's when Bradley Huxley stepped forward. Clean-shaven, tall, with boots polished and a coat that cost more than most men's mortgages, he had the kind of presence that filled a room without saying a word. But when he did speak, it cut sharp. "Get that man out of here," he ordered coldly. "We're not turning this auction into a circus." Bradley owned half the land in Clayville. His name was on the auction house, and no one ever dared to question his authority. But that day, even his voice didn't echo the same way it usually did. Not after what they'd all seen. Frank hesitated. "He hasn't done anything illegal," the deputy said quietly, almost like a warning. Bradley's nostrils flared. He disrupted the auction. His eyes bore into Orville like he was a weed in his pristine field. "I know who he is," he added under his breath, almost to himself, but loud enough for Orville to hear. "He should have stayed gone." Orville lifted his head slowly, his hands now resting on the muddy ground. The name Huxley rang through his chest like a bitter bell. So it was true. Bradley hadn't forgotten either. The stallion had settled down now, but his ears remained pointed toward Orville. The handler by the gate looked shaken, gripping the reins tightly as if expecting another sudden burst. One of the older ranchers leaned toward a younger man and whispered, "Wasn't there a story about that old guy? Something about a fire? Or a horse farm that shut down?" The younger man shrugged. "Don't know. My dad used to mention a Dean, though. Said he disappeared years ago." Orville rose slowly, wiped his hands on his sweater, and stared at the horse as if trying to summon years back into this single moment. "His name isn't Lot 22, he said softly, his voice barely above the wind. "His name is River." A few heads turned. Someone scoffed. Bradley rolled his eyes. But the horse moved, ever so slightly, like the name had struck something inside him. Orville continued, "He was born in my barn. I raised him. I trained him. And I lost him the night everything burned." There it was, the first real crack in the silence. A whisper of something terrible. A memory left unspoken too long. Frank Mallory shifted his weight uncomfortably, eyes narrowing as the weight of the words hung in the air. Bradley clenched his jaw. "You lost everything, Orville." "That includes the horse," he said. But it was too late. The crowd had heard it. And more importantly, the horse had felt it. Whatever had happened all those years ago was no longer in the past. It had been 12 years, but for Orville Dean, it still felt like yesterday. The smoke, the heat, the sound of panicked hooves pounding the dirt as fire devoured everything he had built. His farm, once a small but thriving operation nestled near the edge of Clayville's old forest line, had gone up in flames in the middle of the night. No warning. No reason. The fire marshal called it an accident. Faulty wiring, they said. But Orville never believed that. And deep down, neither did most of the town. They remembered the whispers. How Orville had refused to sell his land to Bradley Huxley, who was aggressively buying up every ranch on that stretch of county road. Orville had stood his ground, proud, stubborn, and poor. Too poor to fight a man like Huxley in court, and too honest to play the kind of dirty game men like Bradley were known for. A month after the final refusal, the fire came. The barn was the first to go. The stables next. Orville managed to get a few of the horses out. But not River. River was just a foal then, trapped, terrified, and silent. Orville had gone into the flames after him. They found him unconscious, burned, holding onto a charred piece of rope near the back of the property. No one expected him to live. But he did. He woke up in a hospital 3 days later with burns on his arms, lungs full of smoke, and nothing left. No home, no land, and no sign of River. He was told the foal didn't make it. The remains were never confirmed. No one questioned it. No one looked deeper. It was easier that way. Now, standing just feet from the full-grown stallion with the same white blaze, the same deep chestnut coat, Orville wasn't just feeling hope, he was remembering. The way River used to nuzzle into his chest when he was a baby. The way he would stomp twice for a treat, or tilt his head to the left when Orville sang that old Hank Williams song. And as Orville whispered the first few lines under his breath now, the horse shifted again, gently like he knew the tune. It wasn't just memory. It was proof. River had survived. But how had he ended up here? Under Huxley's control, being auctioned off like some product? Orville didn't know the full answer yet, but a dark pit opened in his gut. Huxley wasn't just ruthless, he was calculated. Maybe the horse had been taken, hidden, or maybe someone had saved him and sold him later, without ever knowing who he belonged to. Either way, Bradley had him now. And if the man had gone that far once, what was he capable of now? Orville straightened his back. His knees ached, and his sweater clung to him with the weight of damp shame and long-buried anger. He turned to Deputy Mallory and said, "That horse isn't property. He's family. And I'm not leaving until someone hears me out." The deputy didn't respond right away. But he didn't pull him away either. Around them, people were no longer mocking. They were watching, listening. Because deep down, they knew not all ghosts stay dead. And some come back with fire in their hearts. The dust hadn't even settled when Orville Dean turned to face Bradley Huxley. His voice was low, but steady. "You knew he was mine." The words were not a question, they were an accusation. Huxley scoffed, forcing a hollow smirk as he straightened his coat. "You're confused, old man. You've had a rough morning. Might be time to sit this one out before you embarrass yourself even further." But there was tension in Bradley's jaw, a flicker in his eyes. For a man who claimed indifference, he looked awfully uncomfortable. Deputy Frank Mallory stood between them, one hand resting on his belt, the other hovering near his radio. He was trained to de-escalate, but nothing in the academy prepared him for something like this. He looked from one man to the other, caught in the crackling energy between them. "Mr. Dean says the horse is his. I'm not saying he's right, but if there's any paperwork, maybe we should take a second look." That made Huxley snap. "That horse is legally mine," he growled. "Registered, chipped, stabled at my ranch for over a year. You want papers? I've got stacks." But Orville didn't flinch. "And where'd you get him?" The question hung in the air like a knife. No one spoke. Not the ranchers, not the handlers, not the spectators who had once mocked Orville but now watched with quiet curiosity. Huxley didn't answer. He turned to walk away, as if the matter were beneath him. But Orville stepped forward again, his voice louder this time. "You think I don't remember? That night? That smell of gasoline in the barn wasn't no electrical fire. You burned my land, Bradley. And you took him." The words hit the crowd like thunder. A couple of older men exchanged wide-eyed glances. A woman in the back gasped. And Deputy Mallory froze. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about a crime no one had dared speak of for over a decade. A fire no one wanted to investigate too deeply. And now, here it was again, burning in the voice of a man with nothing left to lose. "I can't let you make accusations like that without proof," Frank said, but even he sounded uncertain. The past had claws, and it was starting to dig. Huxley spun back, the smug mask gone. His voice came sharp and venomous. "You think anyone's gonna believe you, Orville? You're a ghost. You disappeared for years. You're broke, half-mad, and living in a trailer that barely has heat. Meanwhile, I own this arena, these horses, this town." And that was the moment Orville saw it, the fear behind Bradley's anger. It wasn't about the horse. It was about the truth. And the fact that it might finally be slipping out from under the rug Bradley had so carefully placed over it. The horse, River, let out a deep, low snort from the pen, his ears twitching as if reacting to the rising voices. He moved closer to the edge of the gate, watching the confrontation like he understood every word. The crowd, too, had stopped pretending to be uninterested. Phones came out. Cameras started recording. And Deputy Mallory, still standing between the men, had a choice to make. One he knew would change everything. Because this wasn't over. This was just the match being struck, and everyone could feel the heat coming. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, Bradley Huxley wasn't the one in control. Orville's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white, but his gaze never wavered from Bradley. "You think I don't know you, Huxley?" he growled. "I remember the look on your face when you saw my land for the first time. Greedy, calculating. And when I said no, that's when the fire came. You're not fooling anyone anymore." The words were like a blade cutting through years of silence. Orville had finally found his voice again, and it resonated with the kind of truth that no amount of money could bury. Deputy Frank Mallory took a step back, his eyes darting between the two men. He had seen a lot in his years as a cop, but this felt different. It wasn't just an argument. It was the clash of two worlds, the corrupt power of Bradley Huxley and the raw determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. Orville's voice grew louder as he continued, "You thought you could erase me. Erase River. But you're wrong. He's still here. And I'm not leaving until I get him back." The crowd watched, stunned. The quiet whispers had stopped. Now it was clear, this wasn't just about a horse. This was about justice. Huxley's face twisted with anger, but underneath the bravado, there was fear, real fear. "You're insane," he spat, his voice sharp. "That horse is mine. I bought him fair and square, and I don't owe you anything." But Orville wasn't listening anymore. He was already turning toward the pen, his eyes fixed on River, who was now pacing nervously. The stallion was restless, his eyes flicking between Orville and the crowd, as if he, too, sensed the gravity of the situation. Without warning, Orville moved toward the gate. The crowd parted to let him through, and the deputy called after him, "Orville, don't." But Orville was past the point of no return. He wasn't just walking to the horse. He was walking toward his past, toward the life that had been stolen from him. "I'm taking him," Orville said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "And if you try to stop me, you'll regret it." His hands gripped the gate, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. The world held its breath. Bradley's lips curled into a cruel smile as he stepped forward. "You think I'm going to let you just walk out of here with my property?" he sneered. "You don't have the guts, old man. You'll never make it out of this arena." But Orville didn't hesitate. He reached for the latch and threw open the gate, stepping inside the pen with a calm determination that shocked everyone. The crowd was holding their breath, waiting for the explosion that was sure to come. River, as if understanding his name in a way no one could explain, turned and trotted toward Orville. The horse's movements were sure, even graceful, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. When he reached Orville, he nuzzled him gently, his breath warm against Orville's chest. It was a silent acknowledgment, a reunion of two souls lost and now found again. Bradley's anger flared, and he rushed forward, but Deputy Mallory stepped in front of him, his face hard. "Not today, Huxley," the deputy said, his voice firm. "Let it go." Orville glanced at Bradley one last time. "This is over, Huxley," he said quietly. "It's over for you." The weight of his words hung in the air as the crowd erupted into a mix of disbelief and quiet approval. The battle had been fought, but the war, well, that was just beginning. For the first time in over a decade, Orville Dean felt like he could breathe again. River stood at his side, calm now, as if the years of separation had melted away in that one impossible moment. Orville rested a hand on the stallion's neck, eyes closed, remembering the boy he once was, the man he used to be, before the fire, before the silence. Around them, the crowd had shifted. No longer hostile, no longer skeptical, just quiet, watchful. Some people clapped softly. Others looked away, ashamed they hadn't seen the truth sooner. Bradley Huxley stood frozen on the edge of the pen, seething but speechless. For a man so used to control, It was a humiliating silence. But worse was the look on Deputy Frank Mallory's face, a look of growing suspicion. "I'll be requesting the original transfer documents on this horse," Frank said evenly, eyes locked on Huxley. "And I'll be speaking to the fire department about that report from 12 years ago." Huxley scoffed, trying to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. For the first time, he realized he had pushed too far. The lies he'd buried so deep were starting to surface. Orville stepped out of the pen with River at his side, leading the horse by nothing more than trust. No rope, no halter, just memory and bond. A man from the crowd called out, "He really does remember you." Someone else added, "I heard about your farm. I was just a kid back then." The crowd had changed. In just a few minutes, judgment had turned to empathy. Clayville wasn't quick to forgive, but it remembered pain. And Orville's pain was now theirs too. As Orville walked past Frank Mallory, the deputy gave him a slow nod. "You'll need to come down to the station later," he said. "But for now, I think you've earned this moment." Orville nodded in return, too overwhelmed to speak. His throat was tight, his chest heavier than it had been in years, but this time not from sorrow. From release. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't forgotten. And River, his River, was finally coming home. Behind them, Bradley Huxley remained standing in the dust, his world beginning to crack. Papers could be forged. Records could be altered. But the truth? The truth had just walked out of that pen, one hoofstep at a time. And Clayville, whether it was ready or not, had just witnessed the first ripple of a reckoning long overdue. The next morning, Orville Dean stood outside the Clayville sheriff's office, holding his hat tightly in both hands. River was safe, temporarily stabled at a friend's ranch just outside town, but Orville's chest was still heavy with uncertainty. He had spent the night replaying every detail of the fire, every conversation he'd ever had with Bradley Huxley, searching for something solid. Memories were powerful, yes, but memories alone wouldn't be enough to win this fight. Not in a town like Clayville. Not against a man like Huxley. Inside, Deputy Frank Mallory was already digging. He'd pulled the fire report from 12 years ago, yellowed and vague, with phrases like likely electrical failure and cause undetermined. But something about it didn't sit right. No interviews with neighbors. No photos of the scene. No mention of the dispute between Orville and Bradley, even though it had been known across town. Frank leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of the file. "This was buried," he muttered to himself. "Someone made sure this never saw the light of day." Bradley, of course, wasn't taking the threat lightly. He'd already sent a lawyer to the sheriff's office that morning, claiming harassment and unauthorized interference with a lawful auction. The lawyer handed over documents showing ownership of the horse, transfer records, veterinary receipts, even registration with a new name. On paper, everything looked clean. Too clean. Frank looked over the forms and felt the same chill he had felt at the arena. "Forgery's a tricky thing," he told the lawyer calmly. "But you know what's harder to fake? A bond." Meanwhile, Orville sat in the adjacent waiting room, staring at the tiled floor. The longer this dragged on, the more fragile his claim felt. What if they ruled against him? What if he had to give River back? That thought hurt more than anything else. But even deeper was the fear that, after all this, no one would be held responsible for the fire that destroyed his life. If Bradley walked away again, what did that say about justice in Clayville? As Frank finally emerged from his office, holding a new folder in his hands, he looked at Orville with a mix of concern and quiet resolve. "I found something," he said. "Not enough to prove everything yet, but it's a start. And Orville, I believe you. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't justice. But for the first time in 12 years, it was something. And that was more than Orville ever thought he'd get again." 2 days later, a dusty pickup truck rolled into Clayville and parked quietly near the sheriff's office. A woman stepped out, mid-60s, sun-worn face, sharp eyes under a weathered ball cap. Her name was Hazel Whitmore, and she hadn't spoken Orville Dean's name in years. Not since the fire. Not since she packed up and moved out of town. But when she heard what had happened at the auction, something in her gut told her it was time to come back. Time to say what she should have said a long time ago. Deputy Frank Mallory watched as Hazel entered the station with a box clutched tightly to her chest. Inside were old photos, handwritten notes, and most importantly, a journal. Belonging to her late brother, Roy Whitmore, who had worked for Huxley at the time of the fire. Roy had written everything down. The threats, the land offers, the strange instructions before the fire, and his deep regret afterward. Hazel placed the journal on Frank's desk and said, "He was too scared to speak when he was alive. But I'm not." Meanwhile, Orville sat out front, unaware of the storm that was gathering behind those walls. He stared down Main Street, the same road he'd walked so many times with his father, his late wife, and eventually, a young colt by his side. River. That horse had seen everything, his rise, his fall, and now, maybe his redemption. But Orville had learned not to hope too fast. Clayville had a way of turning on people like him. People without power. Without protection. Until now. Inside, Frank flipped through the journal, page by page, the weight of each word sinking into his chest. It wasn't just opinion. It was evidence. First-hand accounts. Roy had written about a gas can left behind the barn, about being told to stay quiet and take the week off, about Bradley's growing obsession with owning every piece of land east of the creek. "You think this'll be enough?" Hazel asked, her voice thin. Frank looked up at her, eyes sharper than ever. "It might not be everything, but it's the crack that breaks the dam." As the sun dipped below the hills, a knock sounded on the sheriff's office door. Orville turned toward it just as Frank stepped outside. The deputy held the journal in one hand and a quiet fire in his eyes. "Orville," he said, "we're gonna need you to read this." It wasn't a victory yet, but it was momentum. And for a man who'd been buried by silence for 12 years, it felt like a roar. The news spread through Clayville faster than wildfire on dry grass. Bradley Huxley was under official investigation. The sheriff's office had opened an inquiry based on the contents of Roy Whitmore's journal, and Deputy Frank Mallory had begun interviewing people who had long been afraid to speak. A stable hand from Huxley's ranch came forward. Then a former auction house employee. Bit by bit, the silence that had protected Bradley for over a decade began to crack, revealing a man far more ruthless than the town had ever dared admit. Bradley, of course, denied everything. Called it a smear campaign. Accused Orville of orchestrating some revenge fantasy fueled by age and bitterness. But his voice didn't carry the same weight anymore. Not with the journal in public hands. Not with the people of Clayville watching more closely now. And certainly not with River, the living, breathing proof of what had been lost, standing tall beside the man they once called crazy. The tide was turning, and Bradley Huxley could feel it. But while others celebrated the fall of a powerful man, Orville Dean sat alone on the back porch of a small cabin lent to him by a sympathetic neighbor. The wind rustled the trees, and River grazed quietly in the fading light, just a few feet away. Orville had waited years for this, justice, recognition, truth. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. Not completely. He thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like grief all over again. Because no matter what happened to Bradley, the years lost, the pain endured, the life that burned down, that wouldn't come back. That night, Orville stared at the flames of a small campfire, the crackle echoing memories he wished he could erase. He remembered his wife's laughter, the smell of hay in the morning, the way River had followed him like a shadow. And then, the night it all went black. The hardest part wasn't the fire. It was what came after, the loneliness, the silence, The disbelief. "They thought I was nothing," he whispered to the wind. "They thought I'd stay buried. But he hadn't. And that mattered, even if the pain still lingered." As the stars broke through the night sky, Deputy Mallory's headlights appeared at the edge of the property. He stepped out, holding a file under his arm. "It's happening, Orville," he said. "We're moving forward with charges." Orville nodded slowly. There was no smile, no celebration, just a long, quiet exhale. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't carrying the truth alone. 6 weeks later, Bradley Huxley stood in front of a judge, flanked by lawyers and drowning in evidence he could no longer deny. Fraud, arson, conspiracy. For a man who once controlled land, money, and people with a single word, it was a devastating fall. The courtroom was packed, not with reporters, but with the people of Clayville, many of whom had feared him, worked for him, or simply looked the other way. Not anymore. The truth had risen from the ashes, and it had a voice. Orville Dean didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to. His fight had never been about revenge. It had always been about truth and finding peace with what was taken from him. He stayed home that day, sitting in the field beside River, brushing the stallion's thick chestnut coat under the warm Montana sun. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt present, grounded, whole. The land wasn't his again, not yet, but something more important had returned, his name. A letter arrived the following week. Not from the court, but from a young rancher on the other side of the state. The letter read, "My father used to tell me about you. About the man who stood up to Huxley and paid the price. I just wanted to say, I saw what you did. I believe you. And I think my dad would have been proud." Orville read it twice, then folded it slowly and placed it in a small box next to a photo of his late wife. For the first time, the past didn't sting. It simply rested. At the next county auction, Orville didn't go to protest. He went to watch. Not to fight, just to be there. A few people nodded to him as he passed. Others offered quiet handshakes. And when someone asked about River, he simply said, "He's home now." No dramatics. No speeches. Just truth, plain and simple. The kind that didn't need to shout anymore. As the sun set behind the distant hills, Orville walked back toward the edge of his borrowed land. River trotted beside him, calm and strong. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined him. He had survived. He had been seen. And in a world that once tried to forget him, Orville Dean had finally remembered who he was. That was justice enough.